Palestinian society. UPA has been working in Lebanon for over 30 years, and in 1982, a few years after UPA's founding, Palestinian refugees suffered many devastating hardships, particularly in Lebanon, and most notably the Sabra and Shatila massacres, which I believe we are all familiar with. As a response to this ongoing devastation, which was endured by Palestinian refugees and those in Lebanon, UPA established programs, supported hospitals, and established partnerships with organizations on the ground to swiftly address the humanitarian crisis. Since then, our programs and activities in Lebanon have grown, but the need remains. And needless to say, the impact of COVID-19 and the recent devaluation of the Lebanese pound have severely affected the lives of many people in Lebanon. And that is why we are here today, to understand the situation better and to explore the ways forward to help the communities that we serve. So I would like to take a moment now to briefly introduce all of our wonderful panelists, and I'm going to go in order. We have first Malak and Nimr. After working with underprivileged in many refugee camps for over 25 years, Malak observed that sectarian conflict in Lebanon is exacerbated by poverty and the continued isolation of the host community and its refugee populations. She founded ULIP based on her belief that all children and youth have the right to equal education and deserve the opportunity to fulfill their inherent potential as human beings. United Lebanon Youth Project works on the premise that education BS from the American College of Switzerland. She is active in the running and management of the organization, where she acts as chief executive. Welcome, Malak. Dr. Dina Aina is a PhD and is a licensed clinical psychologist in Lebanon and Georgia, USA. She completed her undergraduate studies at the American University of Beirut, followed by a master's in addictive behaviors from the University of Liverpool, a PhD in clinical psychology from Wayne State University, and a postdoctoral residency at Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Aina has been volunteering with the refugee community for over 20 years, nationally and internationally. She is currently in the Department of Psychiatry at the American University of Beirut Medical Center, a mental health consultant for UPA, and adjunct faculty at Emory University School of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Dina. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitte is a British Palestinian professor of plastic and reconstructive surgery. He completed his medical education at the University of Glasgow in the UK. He went on to do his postgraduate residency training in London. After completing his specialist registrar training in London, he underwent 3 fellowships. He did a fellowship in pediatric craniofacial surgery and a fellowship in cleft surgery at Great Ormond Street Hospital for sick kids, and a further fellowship in trauma reconstruction at the Royal London Hospital. In 2011, he was recruited by the American University of Beirut Medical Center, and in 2012, he became head of the Division of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery at the AUBMC. In 2015, he co-founded and became director of the Conflict Medicine Program at Global Health Institute of the American University of Beirut. He continues to be a senior clinical lecturer at Queen Mary University in London and serves as a reviewer at the National Institute of Health Research. He is on the board of advisors and its global research group on burn trauma. He has published extensively on war injuries, including a medical textbook, Reconstructing the War-Injured Patient, and a forthcoming book, Treating the War-Injured Child. He has worked as a war surgeon in Iraq, Syria, South Lebanon, and during the 3 wars in the Gaza Strip, and his work is featured by numerous newspapers, media outlets, most notably Le Monde, Independent, Telegraph, BBC, and BBC. So welcome and thank you, Dr. Ghassan. And we have Mona Khalidi. Mona holds a PhD in health policy and planning and is a social and health development expert. More recently, she has been working in the production of documentary films focusing on issues of human rights and social justice. Thank you and welcome, Mona. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I would like to pass along our mic to our UPA board member, Salma Al-Yassir, who is going to talk more and moderate this panel. Thank you, Salma.
Thank you, Maisa. I am not going to take up too much time, as I would like for our panelists to be using the time to explain to your audience exactly what the situation is in Lebanon. But a word of caution, any one of us might go off screen at any moment because we are suffering electricity cuts here in Lebanon. And so bear with us while we kind of scramble back on if that happens. Lebanon is currently undergoing the worst economic crisis in its history. We have an economic collapse, we have capital controls where people are not able to withdraw their money from banks. This is, of course, we have a devaluation of the local currency to almost 80, which has lost almost 80% of its value. So we're dealing with a very tough situation on top, of course, of the COVID-19 situation. With regards to Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, way before the economic crisis that we're going through right now, the Palestinian refugees were suffering in Lebanon. To begin with, Palestinian refugees who number, well, we don't know the exact number. The official number is 400,000, which is around 10% of the population in Lebanon. But the unofficial and accepted number is 270,000 people who live in 12 refugee camps all over Lebanon. In 2010, there was a study by the American University of Beirut together with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency with regards to the situation of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And it found poverty rates of over 23%, unemployment rates over 65%. I'm sorry, poverty rates of over 65%. There are many issues in the for livelihood for Palestinian refugees because they are not allowed to work in several professions. They are not allowed to join syndicates and therefore not allowed to work in most of the professions. From a health perspective and an education perspective, the entity that is responsible for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon is not the Lebanese government, nor the UNHCR, which is responsible for all other refugees, but the UNRWA, which is the United Nations Works and Relief Agency. UNRWA, the acronym for the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, is responsible for all health and education needs, or most health and education needs of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and other countries. In Lebanon, in 2018, the United States decided to withdraw funding from UNRWA, which was to the tune of about 30% of its annual budget, which left it with a shortfall of shortfall of about 30% of its 1.4 billion needs for the year. This has gone on to 2020, which leaves UNRWA in bad need of funding. And this, of course, reflects on its response to COVID and to other healthcare and education needs for Palestinian refugees. This gap in services is filled by the NGOs that are working in Lebanon. That NGOs such as United Palestinian Appeal, Palestinian Appeal, and other NGOs that work with the refugees in the camps in Lebanon. The need is great, guys. It really is. I will leave my the panelists to speak more about 4 issues. First, Dr. Mona Khalidi will be speaking about the overall economic situation and how it impacts Palestinian refugees. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta will speak to the healthcare situation for Palestinian refugees. Dr. Dina Aina will speak to the mental health issues that are faced by Palestinian refugees. And finally, Malak Nimr will be speaking about the educational sector. The four panelists will be talking about the situation before, during the economic crisis, and with specific focus on COVID-19 and its impact on the Palestinian refugees. I would like to invite Mona Al-Khalidi, Dr. Mona Al-Khalidi, to give us an overview of the economic situation for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Mona? I think you might need to unmute.
Can you hear
Hello?
me? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and a very good evening to you all. So thank you, Salma. And I'm going to start off by reiterating what Salma just said, what she started with. And that is that the important thing to keep in mind is that the economic collapse of the country and the pandemic have come on top of an already desperate situation for the Palestinian refugees. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon have been living under terrible conditions for many, many years, with increasing poverty and worsening living standards since the 1980s. As Salma said, the lack of civil and economic rights over the decades have led to a very, very harsh reality, manifesting in the inability to be employed, actually being banned from certain professions. There is a list of professions that Palestinians are not allowed to engage in, as Salma had just said. Often when Palestinians were able to find employment, they are paid under the table, so end up receiving less than what the Lebanese counterparts would get because of a deal that would be made. The government would take a cut, when it is official, the government would take a cut of their pay as a contribution to the National Social Security Fund, but they do not benefit from any of the services of the National Social Security Fund. The majority of the camp economy is in the informal sector. It's in sales services, and a large number and a large proportion work as daily earners, daily laborers outside of the camps, which shows us that even before the economic collapse, even before COVID, people were living with no security and no economic security, no planning security, and living very much hand to mouth. Something else happened before the current economic crisis and before COVID, which is 6-7 years ago, the situation worsened with the start of the war in Syria. I'll just go over this very quickly. The country received a huge influx of Syrian refugees. The country received a huge influx of Palestinian refugees from Syria, to the point where now it's estimated that 1 in 4 residents in Lebanon is a refugee. This causes, we're not going to talk about discrimination, we're not going to talk about the situation of poverty, just the fact of having such an increase in over such a short period of time, this has caused enormous strain on an already overstretched economy and an already overstretched infrastructure. With the influx of refugees from Syria and from Palestinians from Syria, we witnessed two things. One, funding from international agencies was channeled to the aid and humanitarian aid for people coming from Syria. And because the camps were the most impoverished areas, the new refugees headed to the camps. And so there was an additional compounded strain on the living conditions in the camps and worsening of infrastructure that, to start with, were not up to humane standards. Now, if we talk about the economic collapse we are now witnessing, or let's call it the crisis, then all the negative fallout that is coming, as we said, is exacerbating an already dangerously precarious situation. Although we still don't have much accuracy from the beginning of the crisis until now, we do have figures from the pre-crisis period, and I'll just go over a few numbers. These figures show us clearly that there was a baseline disadvantage that the Palestinians were facing compared to Lebanese. Whereas before the crisis, the poverty rate for the Lebanese was in the range of 35 to 37%, the poverty rate for Palestinians before the crisis was 65%, and the poverty rate for the Palestinians from Syria was estimated at 90%. We have recent figures that show that since October, the poverty rate for the Lebanese has jumped from 35, 37 to between 70 and 80%. Extrapolate that to the Palestinian condition, and you can imagine we started off with a baseline of 65% under the poverty line. Now, if we look at unemployment, the unemployment rate for the Lebanese was 11%. There are estimates now that it's reached 28%, and more recent estimates that it has reached 50%. At the time when it was 11% amongst the Lebanese, the Palestinians were already suffering from an unemployment rate of 23%. More significantly, of those employed among the Lebanese, 11% had been paid either on a daily basis or by piece. That number jumps to 48% Palestinians pre-crisis were already daily laborers or being paid by piece. This shows us that just how fragile the system is and just how vulnerable to fluctuations and external factors it is. To go a little bit quickly over the economic crisis, I think we can only say that this crisis is severe. The expected drop in the country's GDP for 2020 is now projected to be around 30%. The country is officially in hyperinflation as per textbook definitions of hyperinflation. We are following very quickly in the footsteps of places like Venezuela. The informal capital controls have been in effect since October. The banking sector is collapsing. The Lebanese lira can only be said to be in free fall. As Salma said, it has lost already more than 8% of its value against the dollar. And this is all within the span of a few months. The minimum wage now is $76 per month. That's like the lowest amongst Arab countries, and it's pretty low internationally. We have 3 exchange rates for the dollar, and this is significant because our economy was pegged to the dollar. So on the official exchange rate is 1,500 liras to the dollar. The unofficial black market rate is 8,000, going up to 9 and 10,000, with some pessimists projecting it to go up even to 20,000. The country, why is this important? Because the country imports 80% of what it consumes, and this is not an exaggeration, which means that we now have shortages in foreign currency, which means that we are unable to import what we need to consume, and this is in terms of food, necessities, medications, clothing, the whole gamut. This has led to, we are already seeing shortages. We are seeing a jump in prices 5, 6, 7-fold for some items. And we're seeing extortion in some places because people are in need of certain goods and services. At the country level, borrowing is not an option anymore. We are highly indebted. And because of waste, because of corruption, because of mismanagement, and if you want to put it kindly, we have had failed economic policies which have led to this collapse, and it does not look like it's going to get better anytime soon. So, given that we still don't have accurate data, these things haven't been measured in terms of numbers, and I'm not an economist, what are we seeing? What are we observing? We are observing many, many business closures. We are observing like entire sectors suffering. We are suffering and affected the tourism sector, the hospitality sector, the sales sector, the construction sector. We are observing galloping layoffs. As of March, and we're now close to August, as of March, 300,000 people had lost their jobs. The middle class has been hit hard. People are using up their savings. If people had savings in US dollars, again, remember we're pegged to the dollar, they're not able to access their savings. The banks have banned people from accessing their money. We have an increase in small crimes, thefts, holdups, people having their belongings snatched in the streets. We are witnessing large increases in the numbers of people begging on the streets, begging for handouts. We're beginning to see families sleeping rough as they're unable to afford their rents anymore. We're seeing more and more people of all ages looking through garbage dumpsters. These are all things we did not see before, even during the worst years of the Lebanese civil war. There is a lack of food, and we're seeing a growth in small-scale initiatives for food aid distribution. People are living off of, weekly packages of lentils and rice and tea and sugar. And we're seeing people going without. People are going without meat. People are going without chicken. People are going without dairy. People are beginning to suffer in terms of nutrition. We have
Dr. Mona?
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in and just ask you, because I think we're running out of time, but I want you to please speak to why this would have a double impact on Palestinian refugees and as far as what type of employment they engage in generally.
Palestinians generally, as we said, engage in the informal sector. The informal sector is suffering. Even the formal sector, people are being laid off. The informal sector, people are not able to work. In terms of, if you add COVID to this mix, then you will see that the Palestinians have been pretty much unable to leave the camps with the lockdown. The daily laborers, since even amongst the small majority, the small minority that was employed, 50%, close to 50% were daily laborers. You can imagine that the loss of income that this has caused. People are living already hand to mouth, and so they're unable to sustain that any longer. We are witnessing overcrowding and everything that the Lebanese are suffering from. We can assume that the Palestinians are suffering from 2- and 3-fold.
Thank you very much for that very wide overview of the situation, and really appreciate. Go ahead.
Whereas the rest of the world has resorted to distance working and online working, this is becoming a major problem for the Palestinians as people are unable to do their internet subscriptions anymore. And we see this with online teaching in the Palestinian camps. We see this in online counseling. So definitely we're seeing it. I mean, distance working isn't even an option because people
yes,
just don't have the time.
There are families with only one phone, one mobile phone that they have to share amongst themselves, if that, and which makes it untenable to even think about distance working or learning. Thank you very much, Mona, for that overview. I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, if you would give us an overview of what the health situation is for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon currently.
Just to follow on from where Mona left, and just to reiterate, this hyperinflation of around 50% per month, the rapid increase in unemployment, particularly in the informal sector where the Palestinians found most of their jobs, has led to sudden and severe impoverishment. the double whammy came to the Palestinian community as a result of two things. So the whole country is disintegrating economically. And then this came after the US administration severely cut the funding to UNRWA and prevented other UN agencies from using US money for any projects for Palestinians. So the UNICEF Palestinian Refugee projects in Lebanon had to be curtailed because of the US administration rules. So what I want to talk about are two things. One is the direct consequences on people's health, and then talk about the health sector as an employer of Palestinians in Lebanon. So what we have been seeing as a result of this severe and rapid impoverishment is that people have been, especially people with chronic diseases such as diabetes, high blood pressure, have been going without or self-rationing their medication. And there have been several cases from cardiologists, from diabetologists who have spoken about their patients really starting to take medication on alternate days or stopping completely because they're no longer able to pay for the medication. Whereas the Lebanese have started to leave the private sector in terms of hospitalization needs and go towards the government sectors, that is not an option available to Palestinians. Palestinians who need surgical interventions or need catheterization for heart conditions still have to come up with almost 80% of the total bill, and 20% gets covered by the UNRWA. So that has become almost impossible because people cannot afford the rapid increase in the expenses of the surgical procedures and inpatient care in the private sector. So Palestinians are still stuck in the private sector because they have no ability to access government hospitals. And so what we have seen is an increase in the need for the free services available to Palestine Red Crescent Society, and that is really one of the areas that NGOs need to start really coming up with a comprehensive strategy to strengthen the services and increase the services available to Palestinians by the Palestine Red Crescent Society, because really it is our government sector. It is our non-profit sector in Lebanon. And unless we support that, there is no recompense for Palestinians needing hospitalization. Then the lockdown came, and with the lockdown and the banking collapse happening at the same time, what we have seen is Palestinian families who were relying on relatives abroad sending money have been unable to access that money. So people can no longer send dollars through Western Union. If they do, the recipient receives the money in Lebanese lira, currently at 50% of the market rate. So if you send $100, rather than your relative receiving 800,000 lira, which is the market rate, your relative will receive around 380,000 lira. And that in the refugee community was a main source of money. We have to remember that 2/3 of Shatila's population live in Scandinavia. Large parts of the families in Badawi rely on relatives in Germany and in France, and so on and so forth. Then the other catastrophe hit as the COVID crisis started affecting the finances of the Palestine Authority. the Fatah, which is the main Palestinian political party of the PA, the PA institutions, the PLO institutions, who used to pay salaries to Palestinians in the refugee camps, either those Palestinians who are part of Fatah or part of the PLO institutions, such as the Palestine Red Crescent Society or other, and the welfare systems of the PLO, so the families of the martyrs, the families of the long-term prisoners, all of these have not received their salaries for the last 2 months as a result of the financial crisis affecting the Palestine Authority. So, in terms of impoverishment, we're facing further deepening of the impoverishment of an already poor population. In terms of access to healthcare, we are witnessing a rapid increase in out-of-pocket expenses for any hospitalization needs. And in terms of access to long-term medication, this is becoming, one, more difficult because a lot of medication is running out of the market, and two, this is becoming much more expensive for Palestinians to buy. Patients who are on 2 or 3 non-communicative diseases who require a bill of several 100,000 lira can no longer afford this money. Then we come to the issue of the health sector as employer. There was a severe shortage of nurses in Lebanon leading up to the crisis, and therefore successive governments looked the other way when hospitals in the private sector would employ Palestinian nurses. 40% of nurses now in Lebanon are unemployed or on minimal wage, i.e. they've had their salaries cut by 50 to 25%. Several hospitals have already shut down, and more are expected to close. And so we know of several Palestinian nurses who are now working without a salary with the hope of retaining their position in the hospital that they're in. And because, as Muna said, because they have no legal recourse or no legal protection, they are being taken advantage of. And so the avenue for Palestinian professionals in Lebanon, which was traditionally the health sector, is also shut down. So in a rapidly collapsing pile, the Palestinians and their health was at the bottom of the pile when the crisis started, and now they are buried under the rubble. The only way for us to be able to reach out to Palestinians in Lebanon to try to salvage whatever of their social and economic lives that will remain needs to be targeted interventions along the health sector, in the education sector. I mean, Malak will speak about the education sector, but what we're going to witness this year in Lebanon is a mass migration of children from the private sector to the government sector. And I think we will witness a similar mass migration from the private sector to UNRWA schools that already were having 50 and 60 pupils per class. And so the situation for education for Palestinian children in Lebanon will also deteriorate. And all of these things create health. Health does not come out of a vacuum. It comes out of every aspect of economic, political, and social factor in people's lives. And the lives of Palestinians were tough, and they have just gotten more tough and actually on the brink of catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. That's very informative. I would like to also, I think you touched on this, but the malnutrition is also a big problem that's going to get worse with the economic collapse. And I would like to also mention here that UNRWA, as you also talked about this, UNRWA does not cover all health issues, and neither does the the Ministry of Health in Lebanon. Ministry of Health in Lebanon does not provide any health services to the Palestinians. And there are some conditions like, for example, kidney dialysis that are not covered by UNRWA. And so it falls to organizations such as UPA to help fill this gap. Thank you very much for the overview. I'm going to move over to Dr. Dina Aina, who will tell us a little bit about the state of mental health within the camps before and after the economic crisis and the COVID crisis hit. Mm-hmm. Over to you, Dr. Dina.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to be as concise and to the point as possible so as we leave some room for discussion afterwards. So I'm going to just give a quick reminder of the situation of mental health in Lebanon, starting from the very beginning of this of our crisis with the camps. Back in 1948, people had left because of massacres. I mean, there's a chronic collective trauma that started, a very, very long time ago that's been either exacerbated by other traumas that people have experienced, from wars to changing camps to destruction of certain camps, all the way to witnessing new forms of trauma over the past few decades, from the civil war in Lebanon to the camp wars, all the way to the having to deal with the situation in Lebanon in terms of all these laws that don't really respect the rights of Palestinian refugees as human beings. You've mentioned, my colleagues here mentioned a lot of the different challenges that Palestinians suffer from in terms of their livelihood and the psychosocial stressors, from inability to find employment, to difficulty with education, to inability to access healthcare. I mean, you can imagine how with a population that doesn't suffer from collective generational chronic traumas, that these issues can have some devastating and long-lasting effects on populations in terms of symptoms of trauma, for example, and all different sorts of mental health problems, from depression to anxiety to bipolar disorders to problems with adjustments that also reflect in parenting attitudes and relationship issues and the whole gamut. So mental health, or difficulties with the mental health of Palestinians, has really changed face from the beginning of the Palestinian Nakba in 1948 until now, where earlier on, there was senses of pride, there were resilience factors. Back in the 1970s, for example, Palestinians had the highest level of high education degrees. So the face of the Palestinian community was one that's proud, that was educated, that was very well respected. And this is something that this generation that's now in their 30s and 40s have really lost over the past few decades. So these conditions of impoverishment, the chronic difficulties with housing, the different crises that are happening in the region, from the crisis in Syria to the wars in South Lebanon, have all really impacted the quality of education that people have been receiving, their ability to afford a life outside the camps, et cetera, which all trickles back to challenges with mental health. So you'll see high levels of hopelessness. You see, people, you'll talk to kids. I mean, I remember growing up, people used to think of education in the camps, for example. So I used to volunteer as a little kid. I was very lucky. I went to private schools and I had good English. So I used to translate and so I used to go to the camps and translate to people and donors and such. And I used to hear a lot about, I want to be a doctor, I want to become, this lawyer, or I want to study and I want to work hard. And you used to see things like learning disabilities and some mental health challenges, relationships, etc. But people had this drive. They had this hope, this hope in the future that I can study and I can become and I can see a way out. Now, this spirit has been lost. So over the past 10 or 20 years, with the overcrowding in the camp, the increased levels of poverty, but also things that you may not necessarily think of that would affect your mental health, like conditions of living. Camps are very small, restricted pieces of land, and people can't expand the land where they build their houses, so they go up. So as a result of these buildings that are piling up in this small piece of land, you don't get enough sun exposure. You develop all different sorts of breathing problems like asthma and allergies and all these other health issues that limit your ability to be out, to engage with people, to develop relationships, to excel in school. So that all trickles back to challenges with your mental health that all negatively impact your mental health. So this has kind of been building up. Then you get the crisis in Lebanon that makes these challenges 10 times worse. And with the COVID crisis, now not only are you restricted to a very small piece of land with no sun, barely any, air exchange, and no playgrounds for kids, no activities to do, with people who are relatively you've got people from all sorts of SES backgrounds. So you've got different levels of, for example, adherence to health recommendations as it has to do with COVID protections, for example, and all these health recommendations. So being in this small, crowded area, not being able to leave, nobody able to come in, you're beginning to see a lot of increase in this hopelessness, the stressors. We're hearing a lot about marital conflicts, family conflicts, on top of all these pre-existing trauma-related conditions that the inhabitants of the camp suffer from, to a level and a degree that's much higher than outside the camps. So before this crisis hit, for example, the very few studies actually have looked at the state of mental health in the camps, and some of the studies that have attempted to do that have found a lot of challenges. Some of them are pretty common to mental health across the world. Things like, stigma. People don't want to admit that they have issues, or if they do, they're like, okay, so what if I find out I have bipolar disorder? I can't afford to go get treatment for it, etc. I'm not gonna go to an area that's very different in terms of, religious differences, or, I might need transportation to go somewhere else to get treatment. So what's the point? So you've got this compilation of socioeconomic, social, and cultural challenges that really prevent us from identifying the accurate numbers of the prevalence of these of mental health problems in the camps. If I mirror what Dr. Ghassan was saying earlier about the issue with access to healthcare and healthcare sectors, well, if you think that what Dr. Ghassan shared about access to healthcare is problematic, you might be astonished to know that UNRWA actually doesn't cover mental health. It's not even a priority. It's not even on the list. So there are zero governmental and UNRWA support for mental health in the camps. So really the entire, and then of course nothing from the Lebanese government. So really the entire burden of offering care for mental health in the camps falls on non-governmental institutions and on individuals who are willing to support these efforts, provide their time, their expertise, and the financial support to actually make those services available. Let's, if we dig a little bit deeper and look at the challenges of the mental health sector in the camps, you'll find that mental health professions, all of them, are not within the jobs that Palestinians are allowed to work in Lebanon. So as a clinical psychologist, for example, or as a therapist, you cannot operate as a therapist or a clinical psychologist, for example, outside the camps. If you think about the stigma and the relationships and building in, these the connections in order to break the stigma and to build that level of trust. You got to have people from these communities who understand these communities, who are accepted by communities in the camps and trusted in order for people to come and seek seek help. So while people might feel okay going to a hospital outside the camp for kidney problems or for stomach issues, they're much, much less likely to do the same thing seeking mental health services, let alone that mental health services are very expensive, and they're usually a longer term commitment than non-mental health related challenges. So when you have families that, on top of all these pre-existing conditions, they now have to deal with the financial crisis. They also have to deal with COVID and all these limitations. I mean, my colleagues have also mentioned about the challenges with online learning, for example, the electricity. When people need to prioritize, mental health is going to be also at the bottom of their list. When you've got to choose between having food on the table or going to see a therapist, you're going to choose having food on the table. So it's extremely important that we come together as a community, that we come together as donors and really begin to support mental health and mental health services in the camps, because mental health is not a luxury. When your mental health is in good shape, you're better able to work. The quality of your work is going to get better. Your ability to deal with public health crises like COVID-19, for example, is going to be much more improved. So it's really an integral part of livelihood and health. It's not an add-on. But at this point,
thank you, Dr. Dina. I'm going to let you wrap up.
Yes. So until we come together and invest in this and treat mental health as an integral part of well-being, we're going to continue to struggle with the negative effects of neglecting mental health in the camps. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dina. That's absolutely true. As you said, the mental health does not take top priority, but it is actually an integral part of the resilience that is needed to withstand these terrible conditions that our people are going through. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn over to Malak and Nimr now. And Malak, I will ask you to please give us an idea about the educational sector and the particular challenges that Palestinian refugees in Lebanon face. Malak? Malak, I think you're on mute, maybe? We're going to need some tech. Oh, we can't hear you. We cannot hear you. You need to unmute. Maybe the technical guys at UPA can help out here. Malak?
Hi, Malak. It doesn't say that you're muted, but it might be something with your microphone. Do you mind just seeing if you can reconnect your mic?
I can speak a little bit while Malak is fixing her mic. I can speak a little bit about the work that Unite Lebanon Youth Program does. The UNRWA is responsible for education, as I mentioned earlier. And but UNRWA takes care of the classes from grade 1 and until grade 12. There is no emphasis in UNRWA on kindergarten or on further education, university education. There are other avenues for students who finish high school to get into universities, but ULIP, since I think, and Malak can correct me, 2010 or thereabouts, started offering scholarships to top universities in Lebanon for Palestinian students living in refugee camps. and even outside refugee camps, and giving them an opportunity to really excel in excellent schools and go on to, and even to travel abroad. They also do work with kindergarten kids. Kindergartens in Lebanon, for Palestinian refugees, are they're usually run by NGOs. Again, helping mothers work, helping families by taking care of children under the regular school age. So these two sides, I suppose, of education are totally not taken care of by UNRWA, but by NGOs. There's also a lot of support by non-governmental organizations working in Lebanon for remedial learning, for people with disabilities, with special needs, etc. These are all issues that are not well attended to by UNRWA, and the slack is taken up by non-governmental organizations. There are huge problems with dropouts from schools, specifically because of what Dr. Dina mentioned about the feeling of hopelessness. What is the point of continuing with education if you're going to end up with a fancy degree and nowhere to use it? Poverty also plays a role. There are many families who do not send their kids to school because they may not have shoes, or they may not have, may not be able to afford books, and so on and so forth. In this COVID situation, as I mentioned earlier, as Mona mentioned, a lot of families don't have access to internet. We are all suffering electricity cuts of up to 22 hours electricity cuts a day sometimes. We get electricity for 3, 4, 5 hours. It's patchy. We never know when it's going to turn off. And so in the camps, this presents more of a challenge because people are not able to afford generators that provide electricity when the government is not able to provide it. I'm going to try to get Malak back in here. Maisa, do you want to let us know what's going on?
Yes, we are working on trying to get the mic working. I believe you have to give Teams access to it, but you are, Malak, unmuted on our end. I don't see that you're muted through Teams.
Malak is telling me that she is not muted from her end.
Yeah, no, it might just be the mic access to your computer.
Well, I have a suggestion. We can start with Q&A for the other 3 panelists, and when Malak has managed to get back in here, we can direct the mic to her. Does that sound like a plan? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. So I do have some questions that came in, everybody, and I'm so glad that our viewers have such wonderful thoughts. We have a question from a viewer named Ellen, and they asked, how do we get dollars to organizations, or in this case, from what I understand, to organizations in Lebanon, since the money transfers lose so much of their value? I think Dr. Ghassan had mentioned this. Are there workarounds, or basically how can we navigate that reality at the moment?
I'm going to turn this over to Mona. Do you want to take that question? Mona? Okay, so I
think Mona just has to unmute herself. Okay. It's okay, she's good now.
Okay, I'm there now. All right, so
okay,
a creative way has been found around this issue. And this is very much a random thing, which is that banks have come up with a scheme whereby they will allow what they call fresh money to be withdrawn in a foreign currency. So us as organizations, as NGOs, what we're doing is we go to our banks and we establish a new bank account, which is called a fresh money account. into which we are allowed to receive transfers, bank transfers, and the banks will then allow us to withdraw it. However, there are limitations to this as well, which is, and these things change from day to day. So one day you're allowed to withdraw the entire amount, the next day you're only allowed to withdraw it in installments. So far, since October, we've been able to access that money. How long this will go on for, we're not sure. But this is a situation.
Thank you, Mona. I am also going to jump in and clarify that what Dr. Ghassan was speaking to is when people transfer to their families, and it has to go through the Western Union, OMT, this kind of organization, then people are paid in Lebanese liras at a great loss. But when people transfer through NGOs and through organizations that have a special agreement with the banks, then they have access to US dollars and then they can exchange them for the full rate. So donating or supporting NGOs does not mean that people will lose money on the exchange rate. Quite the contrary. So we encourage people to do that through NGOs rather than directly, because that way you preserve the value of money. Maisa, do you want to give us the next question?
Yes. So the next question that we have is from Maha. Maha asks, can you talk about the coping methods that families are using to help them survive the extremely challenging situation they face?
I am going to direct this question to Dr. Dina.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so one of the most effective coping mechanisms that has been used across time in the Palestinian camps is can you hear me? Because I had to switch from computer to phone.
We can hear you.
One of the joys. All right, thanks.
Yeah.
So one of the most important coping mechanisms that people have used across time and place in the camps is hanging together as a community. So people who live together in, even though they live in crowded conditions, and sometimes you've got a family of 10 living in a one-bedroom home, people have been supporting each other. They've been sharing food. They've been helping each other with babysitting. There have been some committees that have been formed inside the camps to help with security, for example, because that's a big issue. To watch kids from getting into substance abuse, for example, into substance use. That's one area I didn't touch on. But people have been getting together and trying to hold together as a community to help support each other. Also, if there have been cases where some people who were able to get some money from people coming abroad, or sometimes people will give money to somebody else who's somewhere, and then someone in the country pays for that family. So they kind of try to help each other find ways to get some liquidity, as best as they can. But it's been very difficult, especially with shortages of food. The water situation in the camps, where there isn't a whole lot of clean water. There's so people are hanging together. That's been mostly what's been working.
Thank you, Dr. Dina. Maisa, are there any other questions? Can we get Malak back on?
Yeah, let's see. Malak, still, I know Durgham is reaching out to you, so we should hopefully get that. I'm so sorry, because I know your mic was working before. Salma, we do have one more
other
question.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I didn't catch you.
Can I just make a projection?
I was going to go back to our panelists if there are no more questions, and have them give us their closing remarks. Is that okay?
Sorry, there was one more question just about remote learning and education.
Can
Salma,
you give us a question?
Yeah, Rose says, do you have any suggestions for connecting students or others for English language tutoring, mentoring, etc.? Because you mentioned the lack of possibilities for remote learning and education due to COVID.
That is a question that Malak should be answering. I am sure she has the perfect answer to this. I would like to wait for her to come on before to answer this particular question. So if you give us 5 minutes, I'm going to turn over to Muna. And maybe Muna, you have something to add?
Yeah, I want to add something to what Dina said about how people are coping. Interestingly, people are coping also by reaching out to those mental health services that do exist. So, for example, at Palestinian, where we have a long-standing mental health program, we're seeing increasing numbers of people reaching out.
Mona, can you speak a little slower? It's cutting up. Can you just go a bit slower? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm saying one of the ways people are coping with the stressors and with the anxiety and the mental health issues is by reaching out to those services that exist, to NGOs that offer these services. I'm speaking now on my capacity as Bit of Palestinian, where we have a mental health program, and we're seeing more and more people come forward and ask for help. And what is helping is community outreach and offering people the chance to talk, to come together, to therapy, various therapies, etc.
Yeah.
So it's good that people are reaching out.
Mm-hmm. And if I can add something to what Dr. Muna was saying as well. So building on that, so Beit Atfal Sumud has 5 centers that work with families inside the camps. And this is really the only program of its kind that exists in the camps, where you're not only addressing children, but you're also working with their parents, and you're working with their schools, and you're working with their social workers. So, and it's part of a larger program that's embedded in an institution that offers dental services, health services, that's all located within the camp. So, and this program in particular has actually recently lost part of its funding because some governments, like Finland, for example, have also stopped their support to refugees in Lebanon, and they've shifted their humanitarian aid elsewhere. So even those scarce resources that already exist in Lebanon are at risk of being stopped or being significantly restricted because of this lack of funding. And it's very important also to remember that when you support institutions that are inside the refugee camps, you work with people who are invested in making that dollar go a very long way. So while you may invest in humanitarian aid through other agencies that don't directly go to those working in the camps, your dollar is being split between all the different agencies, the fees, the administrative costs, etc. Versus when you work with NGOs that are located and based inside the camps, where the workers themselves are refugees and they live in the camps, they're really invested in making the best use of that dollar. So it's very important to support those efforts inside the camps.
Thank you, Dr. Dina. And absolutely, to piggyback on that, I would say that organizations such as UPA work directly with organizations on the ground with minimal administrative costs, and the dollar, as you said, goes directly to support the programs, and that's the strength of organizations such as UPA. Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, did you want to add something to the discussion?
So if we choose to read what has happened to the Palestinian people since 1948 as effectively politicized, and by politicized we mean the attempt to eliminate the Palestinian people as a political entity and a political group, and that this politicide has accelerated over the last 2 years with the arrival of the Trump administration and the deal of the century and the annexation of the impending annexation of large parts of the West Bank. The Palestinians in Lebanon constitute the backbone of the Palestinian people as a political entity. They were instrumental in the generation of the idea of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle as the right to return of Palestinian refugees, and they were instrumental in the creation of Palestinian political identity. It is beyond the humanitarian aspect and the social aspect. It is of great political necessity for the Palestinian people that the Palestinian community in Lebanon is not allowed to succumb to this economic catastrophe. Maintaining the Palestinian community in Lebanon has repercussions beyond the social and economic to the very existence of the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian people as a political entity. And that is why it is critical that everything that could possibly be done is done to help the Palestinian community in Lebanon through this dark period. Because what would happen if the Palestinian community was broken by this economic situation, as the Palestinian community in Syria was broken by the Syrian civil war, and the Palestinian community in Iraq was broken by the 2003 invasion. If the Palestinian community in Lebanon is allowed to be broken by this catastrophe, this will be an intrinsic part of the process of politicide that is aimed at ending the existence of Palestinians as a political entity with historical grievances and who are part of a struggle that goes back all the way back to 1940. And so reaching out to the community is critical on multiple levels, all of which, including the political, are critical at this phase.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Really appreciate that note. And I believe that we now have Ms. Malak Nimr online or on mic.
Dr. Ram is going to be switching over just briefly to see if we can figure this one out. Dr. Ram. We would love to hear your voice, Malak. I'm so sorry for this.
This is happening because of savings on admin costs, right? On UPA. Malak, are you there with us?
So I believe the Ram just tried a little bit of a fix, but I think it just might be settings on the computer, Malak, on your end. Would you like to call me on WhatsApp? We can try that. I apologize. We did really want to hear from you. I know you have great insight.
Yes. Malak, I think that might work.
Okay.
Is she going to try that? Oh, what a pity. Okay. So I'm going to attempt to answer the question that I would have loved for Malak to answer herself with regards to ways to support people to learn. I know that Malak's program, as other programs, as with Atfal al-Sumud and other organizations, have before COVID had a lot of
Mona, you might want to mute your mic.
Okay. Dr. Ram, are you there with us?
Yes.
Dr. Ram?
Is she going to try that? Oh, what a pity. Okay. So I'm going to attempt to answer the question that I would have loved for Malak to answer herself with regards to ways to support people to learn. I know that Malak's program, as other programs, as with Atfal al-Sumud and other organizations, have before COVID had a lot of
Selma, we can't hear you. You froze.
I apologize, everybody. I know technology in this era of COVID can get the best of us and not work as we intend.
Yeah, I'm sure this also has to do with electricity situation. I'm sure that's what just happened. She probably just lost connection.
I got bumped off. I got bumped off the meeting.
Yes.
Is Malak there by any chance? Not yet. Okay, so the problem with learning at a distance, as we mentioned, is electricity. As you guys can see, we have very poor internet. There is also difficulty in access. However, a lot of organizations will create or can create programs to help students learn through distance learning or through distance communication by setting up on the premises or finding other ways of doing it. So I am sure that ULIP, Malak's organization, as well as many others, would be very happy to accommodate people and other organizations who are willing to volunteer their time and effort into teaching English or other through this modality or other modalities that can become available. So I'm just kind of taking over to say these things. So one would need to connect with the organizations themselves, but I know they've historically bent over backwards to make use of every dollar and every voluntary hour. And so if anybody wants to volunteer, please let us know, and I'm sure we can make something work. Thank you, Maisa. I am so sorry that we were not able to get Malak.
Hi, sorry. I think we might have Malak on the phone. I'm going to place her on my speaker so she can make a remark. Yes, I'm so sorry. Here we go.
Excellent. Malak?
Go ahead, Malak. Nothing?
Can you hear me?
Yes, not so well, but okay.
Education is the only way out of the misery of a refugee camp, and that is the only way to break the vicious cycle that generations of Palestinians have been stuck in.
Maisa, could you perhaps reiterate what Malak is saying?
Yes, here, wait one moment. I apologize. How about now? Are we able to hear? Go ahead, Malak.
Do I need to repeat what I already said?
Yes.
What I was saying is that everything I heard you guys say makes my belief, which was already very strong, that education is the only way out of the misery of a refugee camp, and that it's the only way to break the vicious cycle that generations of refugees have been stuck in, even stronger.
Sorry, I apologize. I know there's an echo.
Or am I just, is the echo annoying you?
Can everybody hear okay? I know that there is a bit of an echo, but did anyone hear Malak's remarks?
Yes, we heard Malak. It's not very clear, but we heard you, Malak. Malak is basically saying that education is the only way out because it gives people hope and it gives people an opportunity to do something with their lives.
That's just Salma just going there, and she's summarizing those remarks. We appreciate you, Malak. I'm so sorry that we couldn't have your connection better and the mic activated.
Can I just add something, Salma?
Go ahead.
So as the situation disintegrates, organizations, particularly like ULIP, organizations that are active in all stages of Palestinian education, become even more important to try to take up the slack of the social disintegration that will happen as a result of all of the factors that we spoke about. Malak will find, ULIP will find it more difficult to find Palestinian students who are capable of making it into university education and then through university education. As the crisis deepens, organizations like Atfal al-Sumud, like the Kanafani Center, all of these organizations need to be supported so that the crisis that we witness does not translate into a ULIP finding itself in a situation which actually it did when it started, where it has the resources to provide university education but cannot find Palestinian school leavers who are of sufficient standard to be able to gain access to universities and make it through a university degree. And so really it is incumbent upon everybody to prioritize Palestinian communities now, to try to prevent long-acting and deep-seated reversals of a lot of the work that has gone into the Palestinian community by a lot of Palestinian NGOs. The strength of the Palestinian community in Lebanon is as a result of the strength of the culture of solidarity that grew up within Palestinian traditional communities that found themselves to be refugees in 48. And then those structures of solidarity that were built around the Palestinian struggle that still remain, even in an impoverished and enfeebled manner, but still remain in Lebanon. And through the COVID crisis, we found that the Palestinian community, more than any other community in Lebanon, was able to mobilize in ways that were much more organic, because it is a community that had been used to relying on each other as a way to get through the dark times that have unfortunately lasted for over 72 years. Those structures of solidarity make it easier to help Palestinian communities in Lebanon than other communities, because those structures are very difficult to build if they're not there. But they need support, because structures of solidarity are fine if they are fed by material aid, unfortunately, from friends and from supporters abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghassan. Just as we wrap up the session, I would just like to very briefly answer one of the questions that I see regarding has other foreign aid replaced U.S. funds. For UNRWA in 2019, there was a $35 million shortfall. In 2020, UNRWA's budget is $1.4 billion. It has so far only received 30% of that funding, and we are 7 months into the year. So to answer the question, there has been an attempt to cover the shortfall from the U.S. funding, but it has not all been received, and UNRWA continues to struggle. With regards to education, I would just like to say, I'm sure Malak would like to say, that's why I'm saying it on her behalf, that when you educate one Palestinian, you pull up an entire family out of poverty. One student going through university, and particularly a good university, leading to perhaps a good job, will become a mentor for his brothers and sisters and friends, and so on. It lifts the entire community out of the not only the economic but the social and other problematic problems that they find themselves in because they are living in refugee camps in Lebanon. Thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists for their time and for their insights. And I would like to thank UPA for always being at the forefront of supporting Palestinians and Palestinian refugees. And I would like to thank all the attendees who've given us of their time and who've asked questions and who've shown an interest in supporting this very underprivileged sector of our society. Thank you all, and I hope we'll see you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you very much.
To all the viewers as we log off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
All of you guys. Please make sure